Adventures in Consciousness by Janeroberts, Chapter 9, Oversoul 7 and the Birth of Aspects. It was unusually cold in Florida that winter. Our cabin was one of perhaps 20 in an area about equally divided between trailers and cabins, an unfashionable place, but quite utilitarian, inhabited mostly by local fishermen and some construction crews who were working on a nearby bridge. I took my manuscripts with me. Though we were in the Florida Keys, we needed a heater, and it wasn't warm enough to swim. When we drove back home, we found the remnants of an 18-inch snowfall. 2 of my students had lived in our apartments and taken care of our cats and plants when we were gone. So the first thing I did was reorganize everything, making the place ours again. Only a few days later, the galley proofs came for Seth Speaks, and Rob and I settled down to correct them. The night of March 13 was cold and windy. We were proofreading. I looked over at Rob, struck by the intimacy of the domestic scene. Both of us working, the cats asleep on the blue rug, the evening shadows just descending. I went over and I kissed Rob's forehead. As I did, the oddest sensation caught my attention. Something different was happening in my consciousness. But what was it? I was tempted to ignore it. We had so much work to do, but I've trained myself to be alert to my subjective states, so I waited for a few minutes, and then I mentioned my feeling to Rob. In the meantime, the cats woke up. They wandered over looking for attention. Rob suggested that we take them in the other room so they wouldn't distract me. So we went into the large living room with the cats behind us. I was going to trick them, just go inside and then close the door quickly. Instead, I went to the window and I nonchalantly glanced outside. Instantly, I became transfixed. I saw the corner intersection below with a clarity literally astounding to me at the time, as if I'd never seen it or any other corner before in my whole life. The entire scene was endowed with a rushing vitality impossible to describe. I couldn't take my eyes off the sight, and I could hardly speak. Rob realized that something was happening. He went to get the recorder, and he set it up beside me. I hardly knew it. For 4 hours, such an ecstasy filled me that I was lost in the scene below. A few inches of snow, the car lights swooping through the darkness, the exquisite private shadows, all endowed with a superlife that evades all words. My stomach swooped as each car went over the very small rise in the road just beneath the traffic light. I never even realized there was a rise there before. I cried out with unabashed joy many times, caught in surprise by a new shadow or a sudden motion of the telephone wire. I'd never seen such brilliant colors, except twice in out-of-body states. It seemed as if the world had been flat before. Now, colors had hills and valleys and depths and distances inside them. The field across the street bristled. The snow was like a live sponge, responsive to everything. When headlights swept across the living snow, I could hardly bear it. As cars passed, I was aware of some positive relationship between them. Elastic, I think. I felt the air changes. I felt the air changes that happened between one car and another, the abrupt yet perfect alterations and all this as one car turned, and the oneness of this motion with all other motions simultaneously occurring. Yet the highlight of the experience involved a piece of crumpled newspaper that kept blowing in the wind. I was kinetically a part of its flights, and while it was impossible to describe my feelings at the time, later the event became part of a poem. While I was actually watching the paper move, all I could do was say, "Wow, that's incredible." One day, a year later, though, while I was writing, an episode came back to me, only I was separated in a from it to describe it. These 3 verses from Dialogues of the Soul and Mortal Self in Time explain what I mean. And here's the poem. It's entitled The Paper. But wait, I see a piece of paper outside the window in the street. Watch it move, surfing in the waves of air, just waiting for the highest surge, and jumping in or leaping up the shining hills of space and flying down the other side. It lands in a blue dark shadow that isn't flat at all, but a smooth, cool, secret creature brought to life by the moment's wind and light. O shadow, brilliant and dark at once, how dear you are in this bright instant of the universe. Now, oh now, the paper moves, I swear by its own accord. It wants to feel the breeze beneath it push and thrills to give it its own response. Oh, watch it go, skimming like a floppy butterfly, wings flapping, touching, but not quite touching, the walk, and lifted up again, dizzy, delirious, its own sounds crackling against the undersides, and the air rubbing upon its edges with a muted twang. If that paper moves again, I think I'll die. I swear I can't look any longer, or I'll take leave of all my sense. I was in a heightened state of consciousness, for that matter, when I wrote the poem, but then inspiration and words were wedded. In the original experience, words were so inadequate that I should have been terribly frustrated. Instead, I felt myself in a world where words had no application. Rob kept trying to get something definite down on tape, for example, so he asked questions now and then. His questions made no sense to me. That is, in my state of consciousness, they were basically meaningless. I understood them, the words, and what they meant, but they just didn't apply to where I was. All Rob got on his tape is 4 hours of ohs and ahs, wows, and excited breathing. For about a week afterward, I'd suddenly see the world in this super real fashion and feel a part of it. I felt regenerated, and I wondered if the experience would splash over to other aspects of my life in any way. A few nights later, on March 19th, I woke up with the feeling that I'd had a terrific dream filled with some kind of new creativity, but I couldn't recall anything about it. 2 nights later, the same thing happened. I recorded both instances in my dream notebook and forgot about them. For one thing, Tam Mossman, my editor, was driving up to discuss the publication of the book about our class experiences. My mind was on that manuscript, which was partially completed. I was trying to get it into shape, and it was stacked on my desk. At the same time, I was planning a dinner for company and straightening the house up. On March 23rd, the day Tam was to arrive, I was bustling about, and I paused to dust my desk when a few lines popped into my mind. I shrugged, and I wrote them down. And here are the lines. Oversoul 7 grimaced at Cyprus and began the examination. Let's see, he said. In earth terms, using an analogy, I'm a man on Wednesday and Friday, a woman on Sunday and Thursday, and have the rest of the time off for independent study. Now, what was that supposed to mean, I wondered. I shoved the note aside and went about my housework. After about an hour, I felt an impulse to go to my desk. Somewhat confused, I stood there for a moment. Well, what had I wanted to do? My book manuscript was stacked and ready. Tam would arrive shortly. It was time to fix dinner. Still, I stood there growing more puzzled. Then a few more sentences came into my mind that obviously belonged with what I'd written before, and I scribbled these down, and 2 more pages. The lines just came, seemingly from nowhere. They read like the beginning of a novel, I thought, which was odd. A novel was the furthest thing from my mind just then, and all my attention was devoted to the book about class. Tam was coming particularly to discuss it. The passages were terrific in their own way, so I showed them to Rob and then forgot about them. Tam arrived as our business discussion began. He said that he didn't think the time was right for the class book. Seth Speaks hadn't come out yet, and the sales of the Seth Material were all we had to go by. More than that, as we talked, I realized that I didn't feel happy with the manuscript at all. I still couldn't explain some of the class events to my satisfaction. In fact, not until the beginning of Aspects in this book was I able to handle that material. The autobiography I'd begun wasn't nearly ready to show. It seemed that I'd hit a momentary impasse. Something Tam said reminded me of 2 scribbled pages that I'd done earlier. It was Rob who suggested that I show the material to Tam, so laughingly I told him about the idea, and instead of a neatly typed manuscript, I handed him 2 messy sheets of paper entitled The Education of Oversoul 7. Tam was intrigued. As we talked excitedly, I realized that I'd wanted to get back to fiction for a change. I hadn't wanted to do the class book, not then at least, yet I did want a contract. Those scribbled pages solved a dilemma that consciously I tried to ignore. In the next 4 days, I had 3 chapters done. I just sat down and the words came into my head as quickly as I could write them down. The book was definitely coming from a different level of consciousness than usual, though I took it down in my normal state. Any attempt to tamper with it from another level loused it up. For instance, whenever I tried to improve a passage by rewriting it to add depth, it lost its original force. Or sometimes I thought a chapter would end one way, but it ended another way. I learned to go on faith with it, write down what I got, and leave it alone otherwise. The vocabulary was very simple yet lucid. In the beginning, I worried about the childlike aspects of some of the scenes, but as the book continued, I saw that these had their own sparkling, seamless quality. The book spilled over into my dreams. Whole chapters came in the dream state. I only had to write them down in the morning. Oversoul 7, the main character, attained his own kind of reality for me. When I sat down to write, I'd ask him, mentally, for the next chapter, and there it was, the words as polished and brilliant as river pebbles slipping into my mind. I never saw 7, saw in quotes, yet he seemed beautifully immediate and accessible. I ended up taking his advice on various personal matters, and his answers came as the book did through writing. I was easy with him, and for a while anyway, I didn't worry about the nature of his reality. 7 was free. No one was going to write him as they did Seth, asking for help with personal problems, because 7 was just a fictional character, wasn't he? He sure as the devil was, and I was going to keep him that way. But Cypress, 7's teacher in the book, that was something else again. I recognized her the first time she appeared in the book. She was the personality that I felt I was when I sung Sumari. In fact, as the book wrote itself, it described an ancient civilization which used a system of mathematics already familiar to me, and the same system I was getting in Sumari and tried to translate. In some other places, Sumari poems were to be inserted. Others used in the book came to me on the spot. Seth Speaks also turned up in Oversoul 7. While all this was going on, I enjoyed the fullest creative and psychic freedom. Seth had already begun dictating his next book, The Nature of Personal Reality, in our regular sessions, but I couldn't wait to get to 7 each day. The book was certainly pointing out the concept of simultaneous time, and in the funniest fashion. One day I might get chapter 10, and the next day chapter 5. I never knew what was going to happen to the characters. If I knew where they were in, say, chapter 19, I didn't know how they got there because I didn't have 17 or 18 yet. Yet, in our time, other events intruded. My mother was very ill. She lived in another part of the state, and I hadn't seen her in years either. My aunt notified me of her illness about 2 days before I was to speak at a nearby college. It was the first speaking engagement that I'd accepted in ages. I also accepted a second one, set for the next week. After the first, both had been set up months in advance. The first engagement gave me my largest face-to-face audience to date. I'd been asked to speak by the head of the philosophy department. 500 college students crowded together in a garishly lit arena. I'd made it clear, as always, that I would lecture or answer questions, but not have a Seth session. This gives me freedom. If Seth wanted to come through and the time seems right, then it's an extra. Actually, this has only happened twice, and when Seth did speak both times on television, he did so with great effectiveness. But I'm a writer, I'm not a performer, and so I made all this quite clear. But I discovered later this fine, open-minded academician had set me up. While pretending to agree and understand, the professor stacked the audience with students prepared with prearranged numbered questions. Each question was stiffer and more critical than the last. As he explained to his students ahead of time, I was to be driven up the wall so that I would need Seth, whoever or whatever he was, to bail me out. The professor took it for granted that these witty questions would just be so devastating that I'd have no other recourse. He had a lot to learn. Besides this, in an amusing turnabout, he had half of the students concentrating as hard as they could, saying, "There's no Seth," while the other half sent mental messages telling me to let Seth come through and prove the first group wrong. During dinner with this gallant gentleman of intrigue and another professor, I started to grow uneasy. So did Rob. Our hosts chatted, all collegiate gentility, and it was hard to pay attention to the top side of events, where everything seemed hunky-dory, and to the sensed underside, where it all felt wrong. As soon as I began to speak, though, I was faced with all those students and the contradictory mental messages. I was furious. The atmosphere would have been obviously even. The atmosphere would have been obvious even to a psychic idiot. I wasn't consciously aware of the specific messages being sent out, only of the charged emotions and the basic setup. I felt Seth around too, and I knew he'd go along with whatever I decided. I decided no. Instead, I dipped into another level of awareness. A sort of Sumari smoothness slipped over me. Speaking, I'd never been so gracious. The questions were answered with unperturbed ease. There were also people there, not in the professor's game, of course, and I more or less addressed myself to them. Later, at a party, some of the students sheepishly told me what had been involved. Certainly, such an attitude isn't prevalent at most colleges. Far from it. Yet, it was indicative of what is loosely thought of as intellectual, critical framework at its worst. The true intellectual or scientist is open-minded. I was upset, though, because I'd expected a philosophy professor to be curious about philosophies and ideas and intellectually and creatively vigorous. As a young writer in college, at least my abilities had been respected. You've come a long way, baby, I thought. Look what the colleges think of you now. And when I got through being angry, I saw for the first time how limiting established education can be. Not that it has to be that way, or that it always is. The second engagement came about a week later, the day before my mother died rather unexpectedly. We were just beginning creative writing class when the phone call came. There was nothing I could do, so I held the class anyway. The lecture had been scheduled months in advance, too, and I hated to disappoint all these people. The meeting was in a city several hours away, so Rob and I left early in the morning. I had no conscious foreknowledge of my mother's death, incidentally. Yet, 2 nights earlier, I had a dream experience, rather frightening, in which I was falling and calling out for help, and I awoke knowing that this was a reflection of someone else's experience. That morning, the entire dream appeared in the Oversoul 7 manuscript, in the chapter in which Lydia, one of the main characters, dies. The dream in the book is 7s. The entire chapter involving that character's death was written the day before my mother died. It was early May, and I actually enjoyed the ride across the state. Everything seemed brilliant and alive from our side of creaturehood. From our side of creaturehood. As I wondered what my mother was experiencing on the other side, that seems so effectively close to our vision. Then the lecture. This was a religiously oriented organization. I was greeted by people who really wanted to hear me speak. I was struck by their desire to help themselves and others. These were well-meaning, serious men and women. They believed in the survival of personality after death, and I was their latest evidence. Seth was a spirit guide in their most conventional of terms. A good spirit also protected me from the bad ones, someone who was spiritually involved, yet available to solve personal problems. A combination guardian angel, father figure, and bodiless knight in spiritual armor all at once. In the meantime, my own experiences with Sumari and Oversoul 7 were intensifying my own questions. Many of these people didn't want me to question, though. And to that extent, I made them uneasy. Fraud or saint? Knowing I was exaggerating to some degree, it still seemed that my experiences put me in one category or the other, according to the people's beliefs. For me, these 2 speaking engagements represented the 2 opposing belief systems in which psychic events are usually considered. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I wouldn't operate within either of those 2 frameworks. No matter how often I said, look, we don't know enough about the nature of consciousness or reality yet to understand our own personalities, much less a Seth. Some people would consider him almost omnipotent. That reaction bothered me deeply. Others would bring up unconscious fraud. Good God, I thought, people forsake all sense when confronted with anything they don't understand. But I myself was still caught up in the same framework, or the lectures wouldn't have impressed me in just that way. In the meantime, I was finishing Oversoul 7. Now, I was concerned not only with the nature of reality of Seth, and Seth too, how real in our terms were Sumari, Cyprus, and 7. Where did all these experiences fit into any concepts about human personality? They just didn't, at least not to me. Not only was I speaking for Seth and delivering his books in the trance state, but I was speaking and singing in Sumari, writing poetry in Sumari and translating it, and writing Oversoul 7. I was using at least 7 separate levels of consciousness and juggling them really with relative ease. My sphere of operation was certainly expanding, but something had to expand in my world of concepts. I don't know how many hours I spent trying to find answers that were acceptable to me. By the end of June, I'd finished 7 and was ready to type the final manuscript. The book had only taken me 3 months to write. My mind was on that, not on any questions, when one night I was suddenly presented with just what I needed, a new framework, or at least the beginning of one. I was looking at the 7 manuscript. Writing it had been such fun that I was almost sorry it was finished. The next minute I recognized a certain acceleration of consciousness with which I'm familiar, and I knew that there would be 6 more Oversoul books if I wanted them. A rough outline for the entire series rushed into my mind in a flash. I saw the separate books that were involved and how each would fit into the overall pattern. I was still surprised and astonished at this new creative material. I was writing notes as fast as I could, and when I felt my consciousness accelerate still further, within a few moments, Aspects was born. Everything clicked and fell into space. I saw Seth to the Sumari, Cypress, and 7, and myself as aspects of a single but multidimensional entity of consciousness. I wrote down what was coming to me in big, excited scribbles, abbreviating words whenever I could, and insight followed insight for some 3 hours. What I learned is actually just now emerging in our time, because the initial experience contained the germs of this present book. Here are a few excerpts of those original unedited notes. All of these personalities have to be considered as aspects of the entity, and this includes my personality, which is the present physical one from which I am viewing these other aspects of myself through a kind of psychological window. I travel through my psyche, using it as a window, postulating, of course, the extra I who disconnects itself from the usual I to do the traveling. Traveling through the psyche this way automatically means moving through time, which is a different kind of structure. Structure in quotes. Seth 2, Cypress, and even 7 are all aspects, then, of one multidimensional entity. Because of my own abilities, I'm able to tune into these aspects better than most people, but they represent the components of personality and the portions of our being that exist outside our 3-dimensional framework. Signs of these aspects appear sometimes in normal in quotes, behavior as uncharacteristic or odd moods or emotions, creative productions, daydreams, and so forth. And then in brackets it says, they may sometimes be picked up through the use of a Ouija board, where they will often be interpreted as guides, etc. Close bracket. As I bring these aspects back through my psychological window, are they automatically personified by the rich stuff of the psyche? What relationship does such a personification have to the original aspect it represents? Our current concepts so limit our understanding of ourselves that we, in turn, limit our experience to fit. Any communications or hints from aspects then seem unnatural, supernatural, or signs of mental disorder. Would a Seth experiencing a Jane think of her as a lesser developed personality? Maybe, but just maybe. Maybe he'd think of her as one with great potential to be encouraged, so that in time terms, he could emerge. He would be me in my present time, developing abilities that would later set him free. No, let me read that last sentence again. Okay, he would be me in my present time, developing abilities that would later let him be him. He would be communicating with me in my time from the future, his present. Our greatest consciousness, or source self, dips in and out of time and has existences in other dimensions, showering aspects of itself out in all directions. These aspects are alive, active, but latent in each of us. where their abilities help form the stuff of their own personalities. They aren't dominant here, but they are in their own realities, though perhaps in ways difficult for us to understand. I ended up with over 20 pages of notes that night, but here I've included just a few basic ideas. I was dazed by some of the implications I sensed, and already filled with questions. Still, when the evening was over, I felt triumphant. At least I was on my way to some kind of theory that would make sense of my own experience. If I was caught up in a flood of creative activity, Rob and I were about to be involved in a flood of a different kind. That night, after the origin of aspects, we were hit by the Agnes flood of 1972. I finished typing 7 while the whole place was in turmoil. 10 feet of water filled the downstairs while Rob and I watched from our second floor. There was no drinkable water without boiling, no heat, no hot baths, and mud all over. Our car flooded, looked like a prehistoric monster, its hulk buried in piles of mud. We turned over one of our apartments to a couple who'd been flooded out of their home. Seth had just begun his second book, The Nature of Personal Reality, a Seth book. But even that had to wait until we regained our privacy. As our lives returned to normal, we resumed the Seth sessions, and every once in a while I'd feel my aspects in quotes, channel open, and I'd take down a raft of notes that seemed to come just out of thin air. In the meantime, I began to have a series of psychic experiences that followed one another. Some came as I followed the instructions Seth was giving in personal reality. The affair started one night when I suddenly began writing what I thought was a short group of poems called Dialogues of the Soul and Mortal Self in Time. Instead, the poems evolved into an entire book, and often the question asked by the mortal self, which is mine, of course, were answered through a psychedelic experience, which was then explained by the soul. No sooner was that book finished than my aspects channel opened again, and in the summer of 1973, the body of theory came to me in various altered states of consciousness. The rest of this book, then, will serve as an introduction to aspect psychology. I present it as a conceptual framework in which our experiences, intuitions, psychic abilities, and most creative endeavors can be considered and explored. I see aspect psychology as a way of looking at life and of viewing personality in its physical and non-physical aspects. Obviously, then, this is my version of reality as experienced through several layers of the psyche. I am not offering it as the truth, but as a means of discovering what the truths of ourselves are. I don't present aspects as dogma, but as a means of cutting through dogmas. At the same time, I'm going to refrain as much as possible from using phrases like, "it seems to me," or "perhaps this is so," or other qualifying statements. Obviously, aspects is the way reality appears to me. There are some new terms, not too many, and I'm including them in a glossary at the end of the book for handy reference. And that is the end of part 1 of Adventures in Consciousness. And part 2 will start next time with chapter 10. Part 2 is entitled An Introduction to Aspect Psychology. And chapter 10 is entitled The Source Self, the Focus, or Particle Personality Aspects, and Personograms. Well, that sounds interesting. Hope you enjoyed chapter 9, and till soon.